you try to keep things as separate and tidy as possible, but you do find that like it does get really scrappy in there because any kind of research is going to be scrappy. Like you're working on things that like you don't know what the output's going to be. You're trying a bunch of different stuff, you get a weird sample and you're like, look at this weird thing, like what is this? you know, you'll find the scraps of paper. Yeah.
Welcome to Transcend Matter. This podcast aims to explore the fascinating interplay of materials that not only redefine aesthetics, but address pressing human and environmental challenges. Every episode is brought to you by me, Emma Wright, a material developer and researcher, to converse with material experts from either an academic, designer, or research background. We'll be diving into their practice, exploring cross-collaboration and their connection with materials. Hello, beautiful people. How are we today? Thank you for joining me on another episode of Transcend Matter. Today, I have an amazing friend, Catherine Mondoa, who I call Kat. I met Kat at the Royal College of Art a few years ago. We were both on what was then, I guess still is now, called the Soft Systems course, which is a textile-led course, but it opened up a flood of all things and everything's non-traditional textiles, soft robotics, novel materials, and it brought in architect designers, material scientists, everyone. And it was an amalgamation of an amazing, beautiful hive of ideas and energies. And Kat is a dear friend of mine who now has moved back to New York. How dare she? And she is a material scientist who now works at a company called Material Connection. And for those who don't know, Material Connection is essentially an amazing platform that advises and brings insights to current materials. So if a company has a material problem, there will be a great place to go to. And Kat will also explain so much more. So this episode, I really wanted to kind of highlight the trickiness and actually the vulnerabilities of when non-designers such as Kat comes into a space that is design-led, and how her ideas and thoughts and her skill sets translate within that. And then also the reverse, and how can academia and design chat to each other and bring two different sort of synergies together to create a really beautiful byproduct, or I mean, not necessarily byproduct, but a product within all sorts of scopes of manner. So I really appreciated this episode, and Kat is a fantastic speaker. She's beautifully vulnerable and has a lot of really interesting insights to being a material designer and trying to communicate outside an academic space. So I really hope you guys appreciate her thoughts, her feelings on this. However, I did have a bit of a croaky voice. I was so excited and so giddy to chat to Kat. Had been sick for quite a while, so we managed to kind of get a date in. I wanted to keep that date in. So my voice is a little bit croaky. You are going to have to accept that, I'm afraid. But please look past this and into Kat's conversation, which I really cherish. So enjoy.
For today, I've got I think my aunt is home. My uncle's gone to work, and so I might go to IKEA with her later and
Nice.
look at furniture and very chilled. Maybe I'll sneak in some laundry. I don't know. Just get a little crazy. If there's time, let's take a walk or a nap or something. But I think it's going to be a very chilled Sunday. I've had a nice weekend, so I think it's okay to chill. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad.
Oh my goodness.
That sounds delightful.
Yeah.
So Kat, to everyone who's listening, I first met Kat at RCA however many years ago, 4 years ago maybe.
Oh wow. My goodness, yes.
Yeah. And we were both on that Soft Systems course, which is amazing. It's like a hybrid course between textiles and material integration, and there was just a lovely array of skill sets and people on that course. I call it like a STEAM application, like science, technology, engineering, arts, media.
Yeah.
And it was definitely that. And Kat, you're a material scientist. and you've kind of that you'd started that skill set in your BA, and then you kind of came to the RCA, and from the RCA you've worked at Nopla, which is this really interesting packaging company, mainly orientated around seaweed or polysaccharides around seaweeds. And then you've also have your own podcast set, and now you are really interesting, and I really want to know more about your role now, because I actually don't know so much about it, at Material Connection in New York as a
Yeah.
senior material researcher, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I think what's really interesting, especially I know a lot of listeners will be maybe potentially from design backgrounds who are really intrigued about the science and the understanding of materials, and when you tweak certain characteristics and variables, you can get different outputs through that you can use in design. So as a material scientist, tell me more about that a little bit, and what actually made you want to come to the RCA?
Oh my goodness. Oh, okay.
We should just started with a softer question, but no, that's the first thing that's in my head. So yeah.
No, that's a great question. Well, I guess the starting point, I guess, for my answer to these questions is like why material science appealed to me in the first place. And that is because I think understanding material science helps you understand how the world works, because different properties are used to make the things that we use all the time work. And so you can achieve those properties by kind of tweaking the formulation, by tweaking the way that, like, the structure of these molecules, tweaking those kinds of structures, tweaking the way that those kind of molecules interact with each other, mixing them with other things. So I think fundamentally material science is fascinating because it's kind of like studying different families and learning how those different families like to operate. And once you kind of get a basis for what those families are, so whether it's the metals or the polymers or the ceramics, you start to see them popping up all over the place, and you get to see the different kind of varieties and nuances and niches within those families. I mean, there's so many rabbit holes that you can kind of dive into. And um, so I think when it comes to, like, as a designer, looking at how you can interact with materials and kind of intervene with materials, I think there is that very, like, kind of fundamental chemistry level where, like, you are looking at how um, the bonds, uh, the bonds between molecules are kind of impacting overall performance, or maybe higher up when you have a specific material. So when talking, I guess, about the interventions where design can come into play, um, I think it's always really interesting to consider how, like, different materials can interact with each other. So whether it's you take your kind of polysaccharides, especially the things that we consider like biomaterials, um, what happens when you put them together? What happens when you put them under different treatments? When you heat them different ways? When you mix them with other ingredients? I think part of it is kind of like a play from a design perspective. I found that when you allow yourself to be fascinated by the way something behaves, it kind of allows you to think a little bit out the box about how you can interact with it. Like, I knew this one artist who was using using rust rather as his, like, medium. So he would get these massive, steel sheets, and, like, he would play with applying water and different temperatures and putting different lighting and things to create these beautiful rust effects on the material. And, you know, most people, you look at rust and you think, oh, it's so ugly. Like, I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah,
It's
because
not
it's
a
not
desirable,
perfect. Yeah.
exactly. It's not a
Yeah.
desirable or perfect property. But I think that's the beauty of where design and art come into the materials world, is that you have a different perspective on what is possible and how you can kind of play with the imperfections or the perfections of a material to achieve either performance or a really interesting aesthetic. Um, so I guess that's where I can see like that intervention being really, really powerful, that kind of creative insight. And then in terms of coming to the RCA, I came to the RCA because initially it's because I remember being at an internship. Actually, I was interning at my current role, and I was so fascinated by the breadth of projects that were coming out of the RCA. I remember seeing so many kind of materials design focused projects, especially projects that looked a lot at sustainability. And I think at the time when I was applying, um, the sustainability issue was definitely a conversation within like material science circles. I think it's always been an issue, but I remember like the main concern I remember talking about, or rather hearing about in my courses, was like, let's say focusing mostly on polymers because that's where I love polymer science, but that when you have blends of polymer materials, it's really hard to separate them, especially if it's, like let's take like your cling film kind of materials, um, for a while. And I mean, it's only kind of recently that we've seen like monomaterial versions, but for a while, in order to achieve like the kind of protective qualities that we expect out of cling film, you have to layer several different layers of film. So, yeah, as thin as that cling film is, there are several layers of different plastics layered on top of each other. And that's just one example. So, because they're layered in that way, each layer provides a different level of protection, and it's amazing at what it does. Like, thank goodness for the scientists who came up with those methods. The problem is that now when you try to, you know, throw them away and get them recycled, everything's really entangled. Um, so there's now a lot more work to create like mono materials. So kind of the same material that's used in our plastic bottles. People have found ways to either kind of treat them or like create different grades of that plastic so that you can achieve the barrier performance that you'd want, but without the negative effects of not being able to get rid of it at the end of its life. So, yeah. And I think when looking at the RCA, I was really interested at how like kind of forward thinking, innovative, and kind of awe driven uh, materials were. Like the materials research came from such an inspired place. And I was so curious how people interact with materials, because I think I was missing that part, is that, we interact with materials all of the time. Like we are literally covered in them right now. And um, I think when you look at the world from that lens, the manufacturing of materials is amazing, and so much that goes into producing things at scale. But I wanted to know more about those things that we touch all the time, and I wanted to dive a bit deeper into sustainability, and I wanted to dive a bit deeper into things that are soft. I think I looked at a lot of hard stuff. I want to see soft
Yeah.
stuff, and so um, going to the RCA was a great opportunity to research in a new way and kind of look at materials through the looking glass, because I realized we were looking at a lot of the same stuff. We cared about a lot of the same stuff. We had the same toolkits, but like our approaches were very different.
And just
So,
for those who don't know what the RCA is, it's the Royal College of Art in London. I realised.
yes.
Yes. Need to reference
Mm.
that. Really interesting. And do you find, you're saying, designers and scientists are looking at the same components, materials, but through a different lens. And do you feel that designers have a lot more empathy, a lot more sensitivity when it comes to the materials that they're using? So how scientists may see it as a very binary exchange of information. Okay, I need to make this harder. This needs to have a certain characteristic, therefore I'll do X, Y, and Z to it. Or designers will come in, sorry, designers will come in saying, okay, I want something soft and I want to feel like this when I touch it, but I also need a certain output as well. So I don't know if there's some sort of thinking in that regard.
So it's interesting because I think scientists and engineers also have a sense of vision, like where we wish like a project would go.
Yeah.
But I think the focus is often to build upon a fundamental understanding, or to kind of collect as much of a baseline of like what are the different parameters around this material? What are the different levers here? And what happens when I tweak each of these different levers? And the reason why I think we like to start in that space is that once you have that toolkit, then when you say, oh, I want this to happen, I can achieve that this many ways. So it's a very, um, I was just talking to a friend about this, almost like a plug and chug effect. Like you want to
Interesting
have.
phrase.
So we used to use that. Used to use that in school when you get like these equations, and
Mhm.
you'd have to, in order to get to the end answer, you'd have to plug in certain numbers or certain variables, then
Okay.
you kind of chug through the equation and you get the you get the answer. So
Oh,
we like to
interesting.
have like a formula or an algorithm or a kind of system that we can work through. And I think
Yeah.
scientists and engineers are very keen on like building
Systems.
a system so that you can create a consistent output.
Yeah. While
And in
design
order to do
is.
that,
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
no, yeah, no, but I think then when you look at the design side, it's very much like something will have caught you.
Instinct.
Something, yeah, there's like a
Yeah.
very gut.
Yeah.
And then you kind of figure it out because you're
Yeah.
like, my gut is telling me this is what's interesting. And then you have to figure out how to make the gut check work,
I call it
and you
creative
follow the gut.
chaos.
There we go. There we go.
Creative chaos is a real thing. You know what you want.
Um,
Like now I visualize something. I know because I've worked in design for so long now with
yeah,
materials. I know
yeah,
exactly what I want in my head. And because I've had that background, a little bit of materials and talking to people like you and going to the RCA, I kind of know how to get there.
yeah.
But I also know a lot of people who kind of just go a bit more by instinct and it changes so much, and which is really
It,
exciting because it is more, you get something called like an identity with whatever you're doing.
yes.
So it is a like not a people say that art is someone's soul when someone paints onto something, it represents what's inside them, while design is a lot more product based, a lot more sort of formula based to some extent,
Mm,
practicality based. I'm wondering if there's like an in-between bit where artists can work with materials to kind of show their soul, but within the parameters that material allows you to work within. So you're still using your algorithm, but it's almost like what gets chugged out at the end. How can you distort that, or can you put variables in between the algorithm to then change what comes out at the end?
and I think
Yeah.
that's where I find like the beauty of what happens when you bring that like technical and that creative together, is that I
Yeah.
think the technical sometimes like you'll get to a place, and because it's very, we need to collect the information, or like this is the information I know and I'm going to apply the information this way. I think the creative element likes to throw a wrench, and because it throws that wrench, you end up with like a variety of different solutions or a variety of different approaches that you might not have expected, and you end up collecting information and data that you haven't expected. And so it lends itself to like, to sometimes I think it creates faster pathways to getting to an end. Sometimes you might throw the wrench and it might just blow up the whole thing, but it does lend itself to really interesting learning. Um, I think that like that blend of how do you use your gut to discern, but then how do you use that really like studied approach to get deep in, so that you know that you have like a really deep, solid knowledge of what it is that you're talking about. Because I think what ends up happening too is that even the way that scientists and engineers communicate is very different from designers and artists. Like I remember like I would talk to some of my engineer colleagues at my last job, and they don't like to speak in certain absolutes. They don't like if you don't really know or it's something that you're still studying, there's almost like a modesty that comes with like,
Is it like an
I
elitist thing?
not really. It's very
No?
much like
Okay.
I think it's kind of like we just don't want to be stupid. You don't want to find out that like you didn't do enough of your due diligence. You didn't do enough of your, you're speaking too loudly and you don't have the knowledge to back it up. I think we're very self-conscious about like, I don't want to say something and then it's like aggressively wrong, because I think there are also like serious implications, especially if you're doing, you know, those heavy manufacturing things. You're doing things that like, someone could get sick, buildings could collapse, so you have to know, um, so I think even when you see like the businesses, the engineers start things like that, they tend not to shout too loudly about the idea, because there's always the chance that that next data set will completely throw a wrench in it, and then you have to figure out why. Because there's no with this approach, you have to understand why. You have to be able to justify it by like, this is why, and it's fact. Whereas I think with design, I think that approach is a bit different. I think there's more value placed on like this concept, this gut feeling that you had. If you can express that in a way that really brings people in, there's a lot of value in that. And I think people understand that design is a scrappy process. Like, it's okay to talk about your idea because you're going to prototype it. You're going to find your voice
Yeah.
in the chaos of this research.
I'm a huge fan of rapid prototyping for that exact reason, to kind of just get the mess that's in your head, that's swimming around, and just go, and if it works very quickly, very fast, very, very craft based, which I love. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And everyone's like, oh, you tried it. But then someone will see it and go, actually, what would you do X, Y, and Z? And then you're like, So I feel it's a bit more, even though, well, my background mostly being in fashion, it can be very elitist within that. Not necessarily that anyone ideas is wrong, but it's maybe allowing the space for your ideas to be heard. But I feel probably coming out of the back of that and going to RCA, the designers, everyone's got an equal opinion. Everyone's opinion is like valid. Well, do you think in the science realms it is very much more, I don't know if you have like, what's the word I'm after, like different groups of scientists and different backgrounds thinking, oh, so and so is more important skill set than this type of material designer? I know it happens in medicine.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an element of like, I guess it kind of depends on your background. I think if you're looking at it from an academia standpoint, like your number of publications will be like, oh, this person knows things, And I think in that sense, there is an element to which like, the smarts and capabilities of people can be based on like, oh, well, if they've gotten trained in these places, or, oh, if they have this cool looking thing on their resume, then amazing. They must be like, they have the brain. And I don't think that's necessarily fair either, because I think there are a lot of people who are incredibly intelligent, who know how to do the work, who can do the work, who output amazing things, but because they might not have like the cred associated with some of the institutions. I think science and engineering are great at building certain institutions. And if you're not associated with those institutions, getting that cred, getting that funding, getting those things can be quite tough. And on the flip side, I feel like with design, I think because everyone is vying for that attention, because at the end of the day, as you said, the opinion is equal. With science, it's like you can spin data a certain way, but if someone else comes around and is like, you'll get caught for it. And opinion may sway in your direction, but there's a bit more the binary there. It's either you have the answer or you don't.
Which
with design,
makes sense, really.
I think with design, it's interesting because everyone's opinion does matter. I think definitely if someone with big cred affirms your idea, then you're definitely going to get more opinions swaying your way. And I think it can be hard, especially when you're still finding your voice, to be okay with the idea that like some people, because they know how to project their voice and have been uplifted, the attention that their projects receive, and therefore the funding and the ability to keep progressing in an idea, it can be very varied. So I think both perspectives can suffer from that kind of institutional, cred thing. And especially in a time where so much is changing and people are working on the craziest things right now.
They really are.
It's a hard kind of race, to find your space in all the noise. So
I usually find, especially like postdoc researchers, they have these amazing sets of research and ideas, and they just put them on the shelf. I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And it's because they're so afraid to get it out of their lab or out of their context. But I'll see someone's worked on something and I'll be like, that's interesting. But what if I chuck over here in this field? That person
Hmm.
can accelerate that idea. Let's just see if it works. And some of the scientists are a bit like, oh, but what if it doesn't? I'm like, that's irrelevant. Like, that's not the point. The point is, let's just see if it works. And all you've lost is time and maybe money, which are very insanely valuable things. But what if it did work?
I
And
think
that's
it's
the exciting
also
bit. And it's just
no,
getting that. Oh, yeah,
no, I agree. I think it's unfortunate how many wonderful ideas get shelved all the time because of limited resource, and I think also, in the rush, and this is also kind of just like a general societal thing. I think everyone is trying to increase their chances of getting the resources that they need at the end of the day. And so if you have a really great, amazing idea and you're working on it, you don't necessarily want, I think there's a bit of a competitiveness as well. You don't necessarily want Jim from down the street to see it as well and accelerate that research and kind of get there before you do. And I think there's an element of like everyone wants to have their thing. And so that kind of collaborative work that would also accelerate projects, I think can sometimes be stagnated because people are also trying to build up their thing. And to your point, there is a lot of that limited time where it would be amazing to be able to, you know, go through each project cycle, but then you might also compromise the depth that you can go into them. And I think because for a lot of postdocs, so much is focused on like knowing something about something. Like you have to be able to know something. You know, it's like a bit of a double-edged sword. I think that's the problem with materials research is that it's so expansive. Like there's so many questions you could be asking and there's so little time.
I know. Yeah, right. It's crazy. And also, I feel like people have this blue sky thinking idea that they're going to find this like crazy material that's going to like
Oh.
save the world. I mean, like, we've all been there, Kat. Come on, man.
No, I know, I know, I
And then
know.
we're
And it's
like,
like it kills me.
what do I do? Should I tell people? What do I do about
Oh my
it? And
goodness.
yeah, completely. But I get that. Like we grew up in very Western societies where it is a very like individualism is a real thing, and
Yeah.
that's fine. But I think building communities, and I am a huge fan of communities, is also equally valid. You do find that in other cultures that I'm trying to inspire and integrate into kind of platforms like this, because
Hmm.
yes, you can protect yourself to some extent, but if you all have a mutual understanding, you'll all get a mutual benefit as well. And that's really,
And
really tricky. Maybe it's
it's
our educational
fascinating
system.
because
I don't know.
I think it's a mix of different factors, to be
It's
honest.
a whole
But
different
I like,
conversation, that.
because I think every time we've seen, like, there have been moments in history when collaboration has happened. I think even in
Yeah.
recent history, collaborations happen and amazing things come out of those collaborations because you have various perspectives working on them. And I definitely think it's a bit of a balance. Like, I think it's fair for people to want to have that certain expertise or they've worked through something and they've earned this thing. They've earned that cred. Um, and at the same time, you know, especially like in the sustainability conversation, like you cannot make a sustainable like an intervention and want it at scale without working with literally everyone around you. There's just no way. Um, and I don't know. On the new materials front, the reason I like I find that so tough is that you know I think new materials or like interesting materials are created and shelved all the time. And I think part of the problem is that, especially in a society, especially in Western society where we have so much and we have so many established things, um, finding a home for these materials is hard.
Yeah.
Like, you can make anything, but then what? Like then
Are we
what?
just are we just
Let's be
making
honest.
more stuff for the sake of making more stuff?
Yeah,
Like,
and
do we need it? I don't know.
I think
Um,
not necessarily like a bad thing. Like I think it's amazing the things that we make, and it's also really exciting. I love seeing the amazing like ingenuity of brands and manufacturers and people, and especially when you can see that they've gone from like we made this thing and we've given it a home. Um, but especially when you're like a researcher, like we like in our MA, for example, or like in early stage startups, I think that's really tough. Is like you know that this thing is amazing, you know it's great, but then finding that home can be really hard, especially when so much is already established.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's having people have faith in you as well. That's the really tricky bit. Even with our
Oh yes.
projects, I was more material led, you're a little bit more design led. I remember tools in some bits, and then it's having people having faith in us and what our ideas are. That is very,
Yeah.
very tricky. How did you find the RCA? So I can't remember if we really discussed this like 4 years ago. If we did in a
Mhm.
bar somewhere, then we've probably forgotten. And then COVID happened, and then hey, lol. Anyway, when you came to the RCA, I remember a few things because I remember talking about like color theory with you,
Oh my
um,
goodness.
very briefly, and you were just like, I was trying to almost say, well, obviously you can get like distributions in color theory, and depending what mood you want, and there's some really beautiful books because the whole patterns, like everything is pattern based. Whether even in design, there's an algorithm in everything we do to some extent.
Mm.
Um, because we're replicating what we've grown up with and what we've seen in the environment, etc. Anyway, diverging. Did you find when you came to the RCA really tricky because it's very different from a traditional university? Because RCA is
Yeah.
just purely MA and it is
Yeah.
purely arts. There's like product design. There is obviously the textiles and fashion and architect, but there's no, I don't know, hard engineering courses really.
No, I think it was very much like build your own experience, and
Oh
we were
yeah,
kind of warned
massively.
about that.
Yeah, and I love that.
And I
That
kind of, yeah, I
feeds
loved
me.
it.
Yeah,
It was, yeah, it was perfect for me.
yeah,
um, but I think when I first got there, I remember like our first presentations. I was so, I was like, what do I do? Like, I was so
in regards
confused.
to
Like, I think our
what they were
first
asking
critiques,
from you or the
yeah,
style that
like
they wrote. Okay,
I think the ask was very different. I'm trying to remember what that first deliverable, like what the brief was for that. Um, I think we'd done some workshops and they wanted us to kind of respond to that. That was kind of typically the briefs
yeah, that
in our
was.
first year was like, we'd have a workshop and we'd have to respond some way.
We done like coding, we done like soft robotics, we done like materials. Then
Yes.
you guys done
Yes,
all
yes,
the
yes, yes,
printing
yes.
textile side, but I done
That was
more of the
great.
other things because we
Yeah.
literally flipped, we switched, didn't we? Yeah.
Um,
And
and
they
there were
wanted to
some like we
yeah,
all had to do. Yeah,
yeah,
no, but
yeah,
I remember we
yeah,
took like a bunch of different like
yeah.
workshops and courses and things like that, and they were
Like
amazing.
conductive
Um,
imprinting, and that was fun.
exactly, exactly.
So
That
going
was
back
really
to
fun.
well, I was about to say going back to school. We were at school, but it was just like it was just like messing around with no. It's so liberating when you're just doing a project just for the sake of just doing something and getting that mind
Yes,
flow, that flow state in your brain.
of just doing.
Kickstart it, just doing, and it's really, really like working with your hands is fantastic. And for anyone out there who's never really worked with their hands, I'm like, go out there and do it. Go to like
I
a craft
agree.
space or anything because it's so instinctive and so primal.
It's very
Um,
liberating.
yeah,
And I think it helps
incredibly.
you. It's interesting because like as you're working, things will like kind of click. But
Yeah,
I think for me that I'd never done that. You know, when I
worked
came
with
to
your
the RCA,
hands.
like I'd worked with my hands. I'd had like kind of
Yeah,
projects in the past, but I think being in that environment where there are people who had been in that kind of craft space for so long and had like
yeah.
a bit of a method, like I realized with each thing because it was very, I don't know, it just felt very like it was the first time that I'd enter a space where it's like I don't have a method for this. Like
Oh,
I
that's so
feel like a bit of a fish
interesting.
out of water here.
Yeah, that's
And when
good though.
people would justify their work and they had these like gorgeous visuals, I was like, how on earth did you make that? Like how are you communicating this? And it's like I can feel it, but like how
Yeah.
did you do that? You know?
I was at a textile conference
Oh
last
my
month called
goodness.
Textiles Intersections. You
Ooh,
seen that
lovely,
one?
yes.
And it was a mixture of like people, designers working materials, and also actual very much very hard science led research projects, mostly postdoc. And one of the scientists was like, "I'm amazed by designers because I don't understand what you do. like, I think I just don't understand your coloring, your concepts, like why you do that, and it drives you to do something else. Like there's no rhythm to your madness, and it's just like, well, maybe the word madness is incorrect in that case. Maybe just it's that someone's personal rhythm. That's so
Yeah.
like so interesting, and lots of really interesting AI projects going on right now. And
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued the moment I see someone create an AI platform that mimics a genuine person's like soul, like identity like that. Because you can replicate music, you can replicate like images because it's
Yeah.
patterns, you're just replicating patterns. But that is different. And I don't know how you quantify that.
I mean,
Um, yeah, I remember this really well actually. I remember you coming to me going, it's all coming back to me. I was like,
and I remember
it's
like having to
cool. Don't
go to
worry
like
about it.
workshops just to figure out like, how do I present in this new way? Like, cause I couldn't just like information, you know what I mean? Like I couldn't just
That's
get,
fine.
you know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
I realized as well, like when trying to kind of find my rhythm,
Yeah.
my, I think I definitely tried to take as many kind of aesthetic learnings from the design experience because I definitely think it helped me communicate ideas to people better moving forward. And it's just, I I'm still working on that. Like I want the way that I communicate to continue to improve. So I'm very grateful for that part of my education. But I found that my rhythm has ended up being more of like I guess I express through the manipulation of material. I express through like, I find that the way my brain works, like for example, in my current role, um, we are kind of constantly on the lookout for material innovations and manufacturers who can produce them, because we then work with brands who maybe they are more design driven, or they might be, so there might be more design driven teams who are looking for a certain kind of performance, or they might be more engineering driven teams, but they are looking for a different set of eyes and maybe solutions from different industries. Or they might be innovation teams and they're trying to kind of see what's out there. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And so I love getting briefs like that because then I get to just look at materials and find patterns in the material, or find new ways of how can I look at this technology a different way, and then how can I kind of bring the manufacturer into this concept and bring the brand into this concept of the material. Like how can I help them see what I'm seeing when I look at the material? Like when you give me a brief about, oh, I need these performance requirements, I'll look at material and think, okay, this checks these boxes, and if you manipulate it this way, you're going to end up with that output. So then I have to convince the manufacturer, like, this is something that you could look at. And I have to convince the brand that, like, if you do these things or if you apply this thing, you'll get the output that you're looking for. And so I find that kind of patterning, I love to do that kind of thing. And I think when it comes to working with my hands, I love in-person lab research because there's an element of I'm either looking to get this output, or I've seen this really interesting thing in the past that I kind of want to push it a kind of direction. Like, what if I could push it this way? And there's such a fun and interesting flow that comes with like being in that. I'm like, oh, okay, I know this works this way and I know that works that way. So what happens if I try this thing? And then if I put in those conditions,
Yeah. You're like a
and so,
conductor.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's like almost like hearing like an orchestra. Like, how do I get all these different
Yeah.
instruments to play together? And when I tried to express that, then I used to find that really hard because then I am more of like a speaking communicator. Like
You
that's
are
how
an
I.
excellent speaker. You are an
Thank
excellent
you.
speaker. You're very good at communicating. I have a tendency to think 1,000 miles per hour, and I kind of just take little bits of my thoughts and speak them when they just make no sense. People
Because
are like,
it's
"What's she
hard
talking about?" And I'm like,
when like,
"Oh man, I'm already on like another conversation now."
yeah, how do you find the words or the things that are like turning on your brain?
Oh, words
Um,
are just a tricky, fun
they
thing.
are tricky, and I
Yeah.
think learning how to like take words and represent them visually or represent them graphically, like how do I show them different ways so then I can take the pictures in my brain and then get them out. So that's kind of how that's been my journey of trying to like express. And I realized that was the thing that like probably the thing I struggled the most with at RCA was like, how do I communicate with people? Like, how do I?
Yeah. Because you need to, like, design industry is a really broad term, but let's say architecture, maybe. Let's just say that. And let's say more materials that orientate around architecture, because some people have certain strengths, certain conditions. So those two like worlds are like very, very different, communicating, and they're really different people, and they've got different types of communication. Like architecture usually pitch their decks very beautifully. It's very slick, minimal words, and it's all in the image, all in the renders. While on the
Gorgeous.
flip side, your materials, you have to have all your data. I know there's certain software that kind of like gives you all the credentials, whether it's going to work on a certain platform. And so you've got two different minds working in those two different spaces. So they communicate in really, really different ways. And it's really sensationally tricky, especially when you're trying to cross collaborate and collaborate, not just going, someone gives us a bit of skill set, someone gives their skills, someone gives their skills. It's more like, no, your elasticated relationship, like you're feeding
Mm.
into each other's brain to create something new. It's
And
really, really hard.
I think too, like because materials, it's not sometimes the material is the product. Like you want the material to be the output. But I think sometimes when you're working in materials, it's really hard to say like because of this thing that I did, the material has changed this way. And like how do you visually capture that? Like I think I found that part really hard as well. Is that the best way to capture it is to almost put it in a product form that people can digest and understand. And I really struggled with that at first because like if you look at like papers like scientific or engineering papers, sometimes they'll have like product forms, but that's usually when you have like HCI conferences, like things where like there's that design and engineering kind of meeting. But generally the images are not, they're not beautiful slick, like they might be like a nice photography, but they're not usually beautiful slick images. They're not really pictures that you would look at and say, ah, amazing, unless of course you saw like that drastic change. So like I remember working on one project I worked on in undergrad. We were making shape changing pasta, so you knew it looked cool because it went from flat and then the next picture was a curve, very clear. But that's not always the case with everything. So you have to be really out the box with like, if I made this improvement, if I've created this innovation, how do I translate this innovation to some sort of form that people would understand, whether you're a material scientist or a designer or an engineer in a different discipline? How can I make sure that everyone in that circle
Understands.
understands what just happened?
Yeah.
Because I'm freaking out. I'm like, this is great. But they're like, you crazy person. I don't see it. You know what I mean? You're not communicating to me what I need to know.
Because it's almost like molecular or like nanoparticle scale sometimes.
Yeah, in some cases
And
it's tiny.
yeah, but that's really like sensation, like super tiny. So
Yeah.
then
So,
obviously designers can't, well, not all designers, but sometimes might really struggle to understand what nanoscale is. So then if you can't physically, because I was going to ask you earlier, what do you mean by manipulating with your hands? Like that's the space you're being, do you mean like physically playing with materials, or do you mean actually quantifiably on a deeper level than that? Because in my head, maybe you say I like manipulating materials, I literally think of weaving, of touching, squeezing, pulling. That's not what you
mhm.
meant, is it? Is it?
No, that's, I mean, there are those people who are working on like the really, really tiny scale. And then they have like
Yeah.
this, like there's certain kind of spectroscopy techniques where like they're literally running along the surface and picking up the bumps in the material. Like that's a level of characterization. That's that. I mean, that is a manipulation on its own, but you're using like massive equipment. Um, for me, when I think about kind of hands-on with research, I think a lot of like the process of mixing the ingredients, the process of casting the films, the process, sometimes if you are able to use that equipment to characterize, whether it's like spectroscopy, microscopy, any of the other, there's so many ways you characterize. Anyway, there's like the element of like manipulating the machines and
Mm.
troubleshooting to make sure that you're getting the image or the data that you want out of it. Um, there's like the kind of watching. Sometimes you are actually physically pulling and stretching things. There's machines to do that. You pull, you stretch, you compress, you squish, um, you try to take a sample and make it into something else. So I definitely think there is an element of that, like kind of touch and feel and mix different things and um, kind of hope for the best. um, so I do kind of see it in a similar way. Like it can almost get crafty. Like I think it's in the ideal world when people think of labs, like materials labs, like they must be the most sterile,
Yeah,
you
definitely.
know, like when you picture a lab, you think sterile and lovely and beautiful. And of course, there's some that are like that, especially when you look at like the biomedical side of materials where like cross contamination can be a huge issue. But oftentimes you go into like people who work with materials, you go into their labs, it's like there's all kinds of stuff everywhere.
Cross
Like you try to keep
contamination is the
things
best bit. You want everything to cross contaminate.
like, ideally you try to keep things as separate and tidy as possible, but you do find that like it does get really scrappy in there because any kind of research is going to be scrappy. Like you're working on things that like you don't know what the output's going to be. You're trying a bunch of different stuff, you get a weird sample and you're like, look at this weird thing.
But how did I make it? Because I was
Like, what is
keeping all
this?
my notes.
you know, you'll find the
um,
scraps of paper. Yeah.
yeah, the scrappy bits are always the best bit. I remember when we had to like during our third term in the first year, then second year
Hmm.
was in COVID, wasn't it? I had to, or we all had to, turn our flats into like semi labs, didn't we?
Oh my
I
gosh.
mean, like that was mixed opinion across the board, but that aside, and the poor housemates who were with us on that journey, all the weird niggly bits I used to like collect in my kitchen and on the floor. I was
Yeah.
like, oh. Ooh, what are these? And then when I remembered, like, because I was quite rigid in keeping notes and like all my variables I was changing, but that's because I done A-level science. Like I done chemistry, I done biology, and I done physics, and not many designers do that. So I knew what it was like to keep very, very strict variables, but at the same time, you know what, fuck it, let's do something really crazy,
Yeah.
and let's just see what happens,
Yeah.
and then we just work backwards almost. But anyway, yeah, those niggly bits were the best bits. They were exciting. So actually, that
Yeah.
just made me think of something. So especially like I'm gonna say like luxury design or like high end design, you normally go super super crazy. You usually go like completely blue sky. You don't really think about so much about the parameters that your design is going to sit within, and you can get this really amazing flow state when designing, and then you just kind of pare back. So you kind of love that and I love that, but actually let's make it a little bit simpler so I can turn it into a dress or I can turn it into what have you. Do you find sometimes in material making you can actually have that process? So you've got one or two variables in your head. So let's say you've got some paper and
Hmm.
you know if you add something else to the mix, it'll become really hard, or something else to the mix become really soft. Do you like to test like extreme variables just to see what would happen? Like,
That's the
and then
ideal.
doesn't worry about if it works or not. It doesn't matter. It's just, yeah,
Like what would happen? No, I think
yeah.
that ideally is what we would do, each time. I think oftentimes the constraints are that you have a timeline, like you have a product and you need to get this thing out, or maybe there's a restriction on funding. There's different parameters that might prevent you from like just doing that kind of. I would think of that as kind of the fundamental stuff. Is like, how does this work? What happens when I play with these triggers? Not just like I want to get here, but like let me understand this thing. Um, I think ideally that's what you would do, is you would look at the situation and say, oh, like this looks really cool. What happens if I do this? And what happens if I do that? And then you kind of build an understanding around that. Um, but I think it's so interesting you brought up blue sky thinking, because I remember we had so many projects that were around blue sky thinking. And I realized through
It
those
was so
projects,
fun.
they were fun, but I realized like, I don't think my sky is blue enough. Because some people have like the
Hold on,
craziest.
your projects weren't blue enough. Someone else's were like next level.
They would be like well, there was one project for during Grand Challenge. They had some of the craziest
So Grand
projects during Grand
Challenge.
Challenge.
Yeah, let's give a big reference point for that
Yeah,
one.
let's get
So when we were at the RCA Royal College in our first term, towards the end of the first term, we'd done
yes.
all the courses mixed together, and we'd done this big challenge for 2 weeks with CERN and Logitech.
Yes.
CERN and Logitech.
Yes.
So the idea, we were pitching what future dystopian, utopian spaces would look like. I'm trying to remember a little bit.
Yes.
And we all got given a theme, and then we had to pitch it. And basically, we got whittled down to like 5 groups, and the final group kind of got this thing with CERN, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I got to like the last 10, I think.
Oh, so good. You're so good.
I don't know about that, but I can't remember.
Loved our project.
So then everyone kind of did these crazy projects around it, didn't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the thing is, like, I remember, like, I loved our project. I thought it was so fun. I loved our group. That was part of the reason why I loved our group.
Yeah.
But it was speculative to a point. We were like all about, if you could communicate with the nature, but through this like really cool tattoo, which is not completely.
Oh, you had something similar to us. You had something. I remember this. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
But I remember like some people were thinking about like symbiosis, this like really kind of almost spiritual symbiosis with like mushrooms and things. Like it was just
that
such
might have been me.
like, what is going on?
Okay, so I pitched to the team and they all thought I was mental, but they're like, actually, I was like, well, everything has like a rhythm and like, a magnetic field, and plants communicate, mushrooms communicate, root systems communicate. What about if you can then take that communication, create an algorithm of some sort? I'm talking very loosely here, guys, so if everyone's listening and who's a programmer out there, you can take that set of patterns, because again, communications is a form of patterns, sentence structure, everything's pattern. If you can like relay that pattern into an algorithm, spit that back into like something that we can read, we could talk to shit. But that's super, and there's lots more to it, but that's from what I remember.
Like that was ago. Like the kind of.
Yeah, and I was like, it's just to do with like integration and like, and we went deep on it. But some of my group mates were like, well, about just like flying cars. I mean, I was like, boring.
No, like because we were encouraged. I remember that we were encouraged.
Yes,
to think like 5,000, 10,000 years in the future.
Definitely.
And I remember like, it was interesting because some people. Like, and that's the beauty of art and design. Like some people, like the ability to create and to like be one, just like boom, like you gave me free reign to think, boom,
so
I explode.
think I'll be inspired by a book I've seen, I'll be inspired by a film, and then I'll be someone who does programming, something like this, and I will be on materials. And I thought, what if you bring it all together and you get this weird mashup bit? And I love that because I think that's really interesting.
It's super cool. Like. That's why I was like, I realized some of the speculative progress is like, maybe I'm a little bit too grounded. Like I automatically think like, how can I make this? I think I started to think of things that like, this is exciting, but then it's slightly achievable. Like, I don't even know if it's like achievable. Yeah, I'm just like.
Definitely not achievable right now. Absolutely not. But it didn't need to be achievable.
Exactly.
It's just, I think what's really interesting, and actually I know a few people who are very much like, they have their bosses, their CEOs come to them, they say, okay, this is the project we need to do, and the guys who are like designing it or programming it or what have you are like, we can't really achieve that, this is only the level we can get to, and they're only basing it off something that they know they can already do and what they can do from that array. While CEOs are very much like, no, let's push it, like let's really like drive that blue sky thinking. So I don't know, I know you get CEOs and like scientists and designers, the big mixture of personality types there.
Like CO, but do you mean like a creative director kind of thing? Like,
I think
what do you
more
mean
of
by
a creative
CO?
director. Yeah, that's a good shout. Okay. I think it's more of like a creative director or someone who's got very much like an elasticated brain who's leading a project or a team. Do you think like some areas like design are really good for those sort of personalities and driving those changes, and maybe scientists are really good like developers because they've got that grounding
to like keep chugging forward? I definitely think this is where I think the personality types that gravitate towards design and art, you definitely get more of like the wow, like what if we could do this thing, and like you get like the eyes, what I mean? Like you're like really excited.
That's why I really struggle to do a BSc because my personality type doesn't work.
It's very kind of grounded in that way, and I think when you have like your hardcore engineers, they'll look at something like that is not possible. Like they'll like, this is what you do. That is not possible. And so I think that's where like the clashes between especially design and engineering can happen is because the designer will be like, oh my God, guys. Oh my God. And the engineer will look like, I have looked at the things. None of the things are telling me that this is possible. So we are not doing it. So it could be a bit of a clash, but there is something to be said for what happens when you can bring them together, where you get a little bit of grounding on the design side, a little bit more free thinking on the engineering side. I mean, you have a powerhouse right there. That's powerful, because then you have the vision to go somewhere and the drive, not drive, the chugging at the issue to make it work.
Yeah,
to make it work.
Perseverance.
You know what I
Everything
mean?
that succeeds is just through perseverance. Ultimately.
So it's just like a beautiful mix. I love that mix.
I'm getting excited. So do you find those spaces that powerhouse that you mentioned has come to fruition, do you find that happens often? Or do you think it's skill set aside is actually personality types of those skill sets? Because for someone to really collaborate like that, like be a bit grounded, or the person be a bit more uplifted, they need to have it within their personality to allow someone to make that change. So not too stubborn or not basically,
I definitely think personality plays like a strong role. But it is a bit of a mix, because every so often you'll have those personalities that are like, they do bring that blend of the creative, the technical in that sense, where they can just kind of keep pushing on a goal, on a vision, etc., which is important. Or on the personality side, you might have someone who is very creatively trained, but then they are happy to work with that engineer, with that person. Like there's like a patience, I think, when it comes to trying to interact with people who have those different personality types, and an acceptance that this person thinks differently than me, and I want to learn what they have to say. I want to hear what they have to say. I want to learn, what their perspective can bring. And I think that can be very personality driven. I think it's interesting because I think like those types of collaborations between design and engineering, they do technically happen all the time. I mean, any product that's going out to market right now is generally created by a design team, and then they might pass it to the engineers, the developers, to like bring it to fruition. And sometimes you have to strip back maybe some of the things that were really exciting in order to make it work, because maybe some of the things that exist now just aren't capable of doing that. And so I think in the conversations that we're having now, I would even say that level of design, that level of engineering, I think is I remember when we used to talk in like time scales, where you have like your present time scale, then you're looking to the future at this scale, the future at that scale. And I think some of the things that we're talking about now are more innovation based. And when you get to that kind of space of like innovation and research, you can have those personalities who are like really intrigued by something coming from both perspectives, but maybe not everyone, it might not necessarily be in everyone's personality to want to push in that way. Like some people just love, like they love to be able to, they just like to make, they love to make, and they will continue to make, and they're good at the making that they do. They have a great skill set. They're great with that skill set, and they will continue to do that forever. And it's important. We need these people because that's the only way that our systems continue to run.
So you basically have like a mutual like community, a mutual like banner that you follow.
Exactly. So I think part of it is personality, but I think also within the community of people, you're going to have those people who are, whether they're designers or engineers, good at keeping things moving. And you have those people, those like people with the wild eyes. We're like, guys, we should try this direction.
That's definitely me.
Yeah.
I'm like, whoa,
slow your roll.
And I'm like, I can't stop the energy.
And like,
it's hard.
You need that because that's how things, honestly, like they keep progressing. So
the people with the wild eyes, I love that. I never thought about it like now, but I'm like, yeah, that's probably me. Oh my God.
And you also need those people who are good at taking like records, as well. It's like so you have your makers, you have your innovators, you have the people who like, this is how far we've come.
Yeah.
And you need that.
Absolutely. And do you think people across different fields see each other's skill sets as equally valuable?
Mm. Ooh,
Exactly. Yeah, because we both have an opinion on that, I think, a little bit. Yeah, so I have a tendency for the last few years to find some scientists prefer to not necessarily collaborate, even though they like the idea of collaboration, but they see academia as a whole a higher hierarchy of intellect than design. I think that's very, very tricky. That's absolutely not the majority, but there is
no,
a
I
slight stigma in certain areas. And then
um
also design, there is a little bit of arrogance sometimes. Like people want to keep it mysterious, like especially some like houses I used to work in, we had to shred all our work before we went in the bin. Um, and I get that for like IP reasons, but no one's going to go look through those bins at the drawings. No one cares.
mm.
So it's just like, well, why? So it's almost like both sides as well.
And I think this kind of ties to your earlier question about collaboration as well, where, and I think there are very established institutions and ways of working, and collaboration between the two has had to happen in the past, or it has happened, on the daily to make things work. But I definitely think it's hard. It's hard to be someone with many hats, and it's hard to find. Um, it's very. I'll rather rephrase it. It's very easy to feel invalidated in a lot of spaces, because I think if you are, I mean, I've met people who are hardcore engineer types who, like, if you when they consider like a good engineer, they're thinking in a very set way. Like they're expecting, if not a certain kind of background, then they're expecting like you have to have this kind of rigor, you have to move this kind of way in order to be, a good engineer. And I think on the design and art side, I think there's also an element of like, especially when it comes to beauty, like who is the authority on beauty? Like who is the there's like on there's almost like an ego that comes with that on both. I think there are two kinds of egos that can be in those spaces where it's like I don't think old school is the right term, but where you're very like established in that space. And so anything that kind of comes that kind of deviates a little bit is like like you kind of get that look of like, what, not just what are you doing, but like you clearly must be unqualified and silly because you just you can't do things this way. And I think that was definitely a big source of insecurity for me, because especially as someone who like kind of I would say that my research kind of builds on both both schools of thought. That's I find that it helps me find a really interesting assortment of solutions to a problem. Um, but feeling confident in my skill set is an ongoing process, because like I'll never forget they're like two instances I'll never forget. Um, One instance on a technical side, I remember like interviewing for a role, and this role was more technical. That's the other thing. It's like when you fall in kind of in that in between where you kind of can do both things and you have the capability, because your brain thinks that way. You always have the capability to keep learning. I remember walking into the job interview after having worked in labs, after having done these different things, and he to my face was like, "I just don't believe you can do chemistry. I just don't believe that you understand these things." I remember thinking like, I was like taken aback. I was like, "What?" Like, hold on. Like, I know that I got my degree. I know that I've worked in these spaces. I know that I've read these papers. I know that I've done these things. And that I have to justify, right now I'm being asked to justify to you, a person I've never met, that I am smart enough for you. And then on the flip, you know, being in situations where like my work, especially in design space, it wasn't beautiful enough. It wasn't packaged in the way that someone who like has like the really well-grounded design background, you know how to really package something really beautifully. And I remember like it was a body of work that I was really proud of, and because it was a more materials driven innovation, getting the packaging right for something like that was really like I worked really really hard to figure out how to like communicate this thing. And the critique wasn't on the work itself at all. Like they didn't know the work, they didn't understand the work. But they were like, what am I looking at? What is this? Like this looks bad. Like this looks awful. Like I don't know what to do with this. And I think there's an element of like part of it is a great motivation for self-growth of like how can I make sure that when I present my work to people that I present it in the best possible way that I can, get as much feedback, etc.
But
Which
that's
is
true
one
to
thing.
you though as well.
Yeah, but it's like how can I do those things, or how can I as a scientist make sure that I continue to learn, I continue to apply my skills so that I do when I do speak on something, I'm speaking with like a level of I know this, and if I don't know this, I know where to find it. Like that's like so I think it's definitely been a driver to kind of improve work, but I definitely think, and it's so funny because I'm seeing so many more like material scientists, you know, reaching out with questions like, I saw that you did this design thing and I see that you're doing these other things now and I've seen the projects that you worked on. So you're finding a footing. And like for me, it's like I'm still like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? But they're like, we've seen that you kind of figure this out. And like how are you
Yeah.
doing this? And I think it's also really validating to see that like the steps that I've taken to get here were not in
Yeah.
vain. There are other people who
No.
are figuring it
Yeah.
out, and there are more and more people thinking this way. So it's not like I'm
You're on your
crazy. It's not
own.
like I'm, and I think for a while, I it's like working off that internalized feeling of like, maybe I'm not smart enough and maybe I just don't have an eye. Like I'm not smart enough. I don't have an eye. And like, yeah, especially in the early stage, there's a lot, like, I don't know a lot of stuff. Like, I don't know a lot of stuff and my eye is constantly changing and growing. And, um, I think because of those established paradigms, it can be really hard to find your footing
Yeah.
if you don't walk in step with that paradigm.
Yeah. Well, you were definitely smart enough and you definitely have an eye. So there's no fear of that.
No, like,
But it's like that almost that anxiety because that's been fed into your system through various ways has become a bit of a driver. And actually that's not a bad thing.
yeah,
That's quite an interesting catalyst actually. If you can turn
yeah.
effectively like a negative opinion into something really positive, that's a really
And I don't
good way
mean
to
to make
move
this
forward.
like a horrible sob story, but I think when we're
No,
talking about like
don't,
these
not at
issues
all.
of
Don't be
collaboration
silly.
and stuff, like I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
these are the things that fall through the cracks,
massively. Yeah. And
you
did
know?
you find after your MA, like what were you going to do? Because there was there's none of these, like I was in a similar situation where there's none of these jobs that allowed you to, jobs is such a horrible word, isn't it?
It's true.
I hate that word so much. I'm not clever enough to use a better word. Anyway,
Stop.
there's none of these jobs that have this really interesting design amalgamation with research. So did you really struggle with that then? Essentially what you're saying, I feel.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think like, well, first off, especially after the way that COVID hit, I remember like after I graduated my undergrad and I knew I was going to the RCA, but I remember looking at the landscape just then and thinking, oh my goodness, like, I've seen friends who like, they seem to know the system, they seem to know the game. They picked wonderful engineering degrees, they'd gone to these wonderful engineering companies, they were doing amazing things. And here I was with like my brain kind of thinking a different way. And I was like, okay, where do I fit? And then when you went to RCA and COVID hit, I remember the year 2020, those graduates, I mean, I've never seen, it's like people were so obviously robbed of opportunity, and so it was awful. Like watching what happened to the grads, like they worked so hard, they created such beautiful bodies of work, and it was so hard for people to find places. Um, and I remember even like on like a visa standpoint, I mean, I came to the UK as an American citizen, and so there was an amazing visa. There's like a graduate visa that if you did a master's or a PhD, you would get 2 or 3 years respectively afterward. And they were supposed to have, apparently, they were supposed to have re-release that visa in 2020. And it was pushed to our graduation year. So a lot of international students who done amazing work and could have continued to do that amazing work, in the UK had to figure out what they were going to do, you know? So I think there were a lot of nuances to that conversation. And I remember like that really freaked me out. Like I was like, whoa, mm-mm. And so I like was very aggressively job searching, even from like way then to the time that we graduated, just trying to figure out like, what will that next step look like? Um, and to your point, I think research has always existed within institutions, as a part of what keeps them going, because you need the research in order to improve the product or to create the next thing. There's like two sides to the research. Like you have an existing product, you need better, and so on and so forth. So research has always existed in that capacity, but it lives in different names. And I think it's really hard. It feels a little bit shrouded. And it's hard to get your foot in the door. And at the same time, especially from a materials perspective, I think we've definitely seen in recent history, either startups that have existed for like, 10 plus years, they've finally gotten to a point where like they're scaling and they're expanding, which means that there are more opportunities for these researchers. And at the same time, like especially leaving RCA, you meet so many people from whether it's RCA, CSM, wherever, who have created these amazing things and want to see how far they can push them. But the problem is in a lot of those instances, those things are really early stage. So if you're not able to kind of get your foot in there, it can be really,
super hard,
really disheartening.
Yeah.
Really, really disheartening.
Yeah. I remember I lost like 2 or 3 research papers that I co-wrote with Ahu. Ahu's like a scientist from Manchester. And I actually got really disheartened that I didn't get these like papers. And I was like, no, keep going. But it can really tear you down, can't it? Because you don't have anything to like, no real decent feedback. And all these people, like it's UKRI and other platforms, mostly with scientists looking at it. And when you do inject that design level a little bit, they go, huh?
Yeah. It's like, what is that?
I'm like, oh, never mind. But yeah, it is maybe COVID created this weird landscape as well.
Yeah, I definitely think COVID contributed to it. And I think, that there part of it is that so many kind of new spaces are being crafted, so many different ways of thinking are kind of merging. And I think it's also interesting that like materials are even becoming more of a conversation piece because, especially with the sustainability conversation, I mean, most material innovations would be happening in the background. Like, we care about, the thing is we have always needed materials. Materials are a key part of any product, but, I think it's something that was generally taken for granted. And now there are more eyeballs on it because materials actually matter a lot, and at the same time, like the speed at which those opportunities and those spaces to, research in that way, they're quite limited. So if you're interested in that kind of research, it can be really tough, but it does exist. And I'm really excited every time I see more and more of these kinds of roles pop up. But it is hard.
Yeah. I think I've got like 2
really
final questions for you, I guess. Like, how are you finding Material Connection in that regard? Like, is it a really good platform for this kind of nice melting pot of like conversations? And also for like designers, let's say just textile designers who are really intrigued about material science, but they might not want to go completely too deep into a research paper, but even if they do, like, where can they start to understand? Because my A-level background allowed me to understand a lot of things very, very
Mm-hmm.
quickly. I knew what pollens were and I knew all about everything in that regard. I obviously just wasn't a specialist enough to kind of go very like a pinpoint deep dive like you do at university and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Well, first speaking about material connection, I think it's an amazing resource. I mean, I think, I'm sure you've seen various material libraries around the world. It's exciting seeing them pop up all over the place, trying to curate, these marks of human innovation. And what I love so much about it is so cross industry. Like we work with clients and projects on such a big scale. Like it might be from an interior to sports to automotive to, I don't know, like it's just the range of different projects is incredible, and the range of different materials that we come in contact with is incredible. I mean, I think more than anything, I think it's given me so much more respect. And I do material science because I think it's awesome. Like I think it's awesome. I love it. And I have so much more respect for the manufacturers who have worked hard to create these things and to bring them to a certain level and a certain scale where like they can be adopted. Because it takes so much investment of time and resource and brain power to make some of these things work. So I'm always like blown away, when I see some crazy new material enter our library, or someone comes with a project and I think, oh my gosh, like this material would be perfect for this. Like this would be so perfect. Like I think that element of connection is unmatched, and I think sometimes I think to myself, the only thing I wish I could do is be in a lab sometimes, help with the connection on this part, but then also like be there to help develop it more.
You want
But
to get your
there's only
hands
so much
messy.
time. Yeah, or like see the beginning to the end. I love
Yeah.
being in this beginning research innovation phase, but I love to see more. So yeah, material connection it's been an amazing ride so far. Um, and I think for designers who are really interested in research, or they kind of want to expand the technical skill set, which I think is very useful, especially when you're looking at these more materials driven roles. One thing I would say is it's very good to connect to technical people who believe in and are intrigued by your work. I think when you form those kinds of relationships, it creates a nice kind of safe space to cross pollinate. So I personally use LinkedIn a lot. I know a lot of designers tend to rely most heavily on Instagram. If you're not really using LinkedIn, I would highly recommend diving a little bit deeper into that. Create your profile, search LinkedIn for like the terms that you're interested in. That there are textile engineers. Like if you're a textile designer, a textile artist, there are textile engineers. Um, there are textile scientists who again look very similarly at the kinds of work that you do, but they're approaching it very differently. And so I think connecting with them is useful, especially on a platform like LinkedIn, because that's where a lot of technical people tend to live more than on Instagram, because we're not as visually driven. So that's a great space to like hear, okay, in the textile engineering and science world, what are some of the innovations that are coming out? What are some of the papers that are out? What are some of the terms that they're using? So following those people, connecting with them, having conversations to hear what they're doing. So it gives you a starting point to kind of dive deeper. Um, I think people always talk about like free online courses or online courses you can take that are, about polymer science, things like that. So if that is something you're interested in, I would go for that as well. Um, and I think, especially with like the ways that jobs, especially if you look on LinkedIn, the way those jobs are typically pitched, it's either technical or creative. Every so often you'll get the crossover, and that's like the unicorn. We love those. And more of those are kind of popping, but they're not as often. So I think it's going to be a battle. And I think especially if you're in your MA or you're in some sort of graduate program and you have the space to do this, I would look at those roles and I would look at some of the skill sets that they're talking about. And I would start to look at like, where are the places and spaces where maybe I can start to pick those things up? So if you're at RCA, for example, and they're talking about characterization techniques, or they're talking about a certain fundamental understanding of certain chemistries, in addition to whatever development role this might be, because they're often development roles of different varieties. Imperial's down the street. I mean, they always used to say that, like, you should talk to Imperial, and that was always really hard. But I would say, like, for real, like, look around. You're in London. You're in you're in an amazing place. Like, not Imperial, Queen Mary, even other RCA people. They're technical people at RCA. I was a technical person at RCA. Talk to those people.
Or even
I think,
if you're at a different university that you have technical people within, like whether you're
reach out.
I don't know, Rose Island or what have you.
Because the thing is that the biggest barrier to learning is you. It's not necessarily like your ability to take it in. It's more like you have to identify what it is that you're looking to understand and over time kind of get there. And I think it's a thing to you don't have to become an absolute expert on these things. I think I've realized as well, part of the job is learning how to do the job so that you can make it your own and do it effectively. So I think those are my starting points. So those would be my kind of starting points for that kind of design side where you want to break in. And I think if you're more project driven, because projects also speak a lot, I would say find a project as you're working on your projects, see some of the skills that they're talking about and see if there are ways in your project that you can integrate that kind of learning and that kind of process into your project. Because I think if you can speak to how you've used some of these skills or how you've learned some of these skills through a project, that also speaks volumes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. It's just being brave and putting yourself out there. And the worst thing that can happen is if they don't respond, then you just keep on trying.
Yeah.
That perseverance is just...
And they will not respond and reject so many times. So many times.
That's the world. People have got busy lives and...
Yeah. It builds a kind of resilience.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's so true. This has been really interesting. And if people want to get in contact with you, if I'm sure you wouldn't mind. Yeah, good. You're nodding away. I'm just like sending you out there into the world. How should they contact you? Just to like, they're inspired by you and obviously your work.
Well, if you can reach me on LinkedIn, plug for LinkedIn.
So that's Catherine Mondoa, but it'll be
Catherine Mondoa.
It's all in the info, so it's all good.
So you can reach me there. And then, as Emma mentioned earlier, I also have a podcast.
Yes.
So you can reach me through that website.
Material People.
Yes, it's called Materials People. Again, I'm a nerdy materials person. What can I say?
I like it because you bring two really different, I suppose, like people and didn't you? Yeah. That was fun doing that. I enjoyed that. I feel like
Emma was part of it. So you can listen to Emma's episode. Very fun stuff.
Got a while ago, isn't it? And you got your season 2 coming out as well, which is really, really lovely.
Yes, we are working on season 2. So it's very exciting. But you are very welcome to reach out there. And also, as Emma's mentioned about busyness, please reach out, connect, follow. I try to like and repost things as much as I can, especially when it comes to jobs, because I understand how tough it can be. Am I a perfect responder all the time? No. But I do love having these conversations. So,
and I think what we can take away from today is that essentially is not knowing everything about everyone's skill sets, having the patience to listen and respect other people's skill sets, and also having like a community or a banner or some sort of like title that you all want to follow. If you're a scientist or a designer, an engineer, what have you, if you want to have that real interesting, true collaboration where your ideas are elasticated between each other, that's the kind of the essence we're getting.
Yeah.
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 They're
But
hard.
it's a journey.
Hard.
It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, because we've been brought up in a schooling system where art's over there, science is over there. And it's been like that for hundreds of years, like hundreds of years. So, I mean, maybe it's institutionalized like that. It takes a lot of unpicking.
Yeah. But it's valuable. And I think more than anything, I think that's what I also want people to take away, is that what the work that you do is valuable. And as long as you're willing to keep learning and improving, then, it will work out in its time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kat, for joining. I hope my voice hasn't been too bad.
Not at all. I'm telling you, it sounds great.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah, I love it.
I hope it's a good weather over there in New York. You're so far away. Come back to London, please. I miss you. I'll see you in 3D.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And if we ever do something together, we'll let the world know.
Absolutely. And this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Emma.
Oh, thank you for joining.
For hosting this conversation.
That's okay. I just like chatting to people, and then I think, Emma, don't swear, don't do this. I'm like, oh, whoops, said it. It's fine. It's 2023. Let's get over it.
It's fine.
Well, have a wonderful day, and thank you for being here. And your spirit and energy has been amazing as always. Oh,
thank you, Brett. I miss you.
You're welcome. And yeah, thank you for everyone for listening. Ciao.
Transcend Matter is a series-based podcast with monthly bonus episodes. We would love you to join our material community, so please do follow us. This will really help spread all the information we have here to a wider audience. We hope you have been inspired and will join us on the next show. This podcast was brought to you by Studio Osmo, bringing together a collection of minds and skills to accelerate future innovation within materials.